Hi everyone, here's the Bookchemist once again, and today I'm reviewing Neuromancer by William Gibson, one of the books that's been recommended the most by you guys, and a book that comes up a lot in discussions of, the most difficult book you've ever read, very difficult books, challenging ones, books that confuse people, and I can definitely see why that is the case. I often find parallels drawn between this book and the fiction of Thomas Pynchon, a writer I appreciate a lot, one of my favorite writers, and another famously difficult one. I don't think there's that much of a similarity in terms of style, in terms of prose, between Gibson and Pynchon, not excessively at least, but there is the effect their fiction has, at least it had on me, is the same. Which means that when I was reading Neuromancer, I was getting what was going on, what was happening. If at the end you asked me to write a summary of the novel, I'd be able to give you a correct summary of the plot and, features of the characters and that kind of stuff. And I know that because I actually checked once I finished the novel to make sure I'd gotten it right. Why did I check? Because the point is that, while you'll be reading it, you'll still feel that constant feeling of confusion, and you'll feel that constant feeling of disorientation, and you'll wonder what the hell is going on. Here, the two writers differ very much because Pynchon's disorientation often has to do with the theme of his novels, like the paranoia of Lot 49 and the fact that the book makes some people feel paranoid themselves. The only book where that type of disorientation, one of the rare cases at least in Pynchon, where that type of disorientation has to do with the fact that what you're reading about is difficult to actually imagine, is Bleeding Edge, which deals with a very bizarre software slash web game slash websites called Departure that is halfway between a chat room and a massive online RPG, and that it's very often not that clear how you are even supposed to visualize it. And the point is that the whole of Neuromancer is set, most of it, large chunks of it, are set in a world of that type, in the so-called cyberspace that Gibson himself apparently invented as a term. This novel is set in a world, in a not-so-far future, that very much like the futures imagined by Jules Verne, one of my very favorite science fiction writers, and a writer that is actually honored in Neuromancer, is a future that in so many ways we've already reached, and it's a future that became a reality, and in so many other ways is very different from the one we live in, and the contrast between these two situations is very stimulating while you read the novel, and you'll keep thinking, well, has this innovation already happened? Is it going to happen? Was the writer simply wrong? And in particular, this is set in a world where the cyberspace, World Wide Web, is a reality where people spend a lot of their time, and you have these borderline criminals slash artists called cowboys who exploit the cyberspace to earn big money. And if I sound like this, it's because it's difficult for me to describe this world, because once again it's difficult for me to visualize it. That, I think, is one of the main things that makes this novel so confusing. The other thing is its language and the way this cyber world is described, and the slang used by the novel, which I understand comes from a Canadian slang from the 60s and 70s. Whatever. I mean, he flipped back. His program had reached the fifth gate. He watched as his icebreaker strobed and shifted in front of him, only faintly aware of his hands playing across the deck, making minor adjustments. Translucent planes of color shuffled like a trick deck. Take a card, he thought. Any card. I mean, what the fuck is even going on? And this is actually one of the most understandable passages when it comes to being immersed in this cyberspace. And which is, I want to say that this is going to be one of those love it or hate it types of novels, even though I did neither of the two. I have to admit I'm not that hot for this type of innovative, challenging, slangy, very technical type of prose. But at the same time, I have to admit that my issue with that type of fiction, with some fiction people would call either slipstream or some sub-varieties of contemporary science fiction, is that very often I feel that it offers a very little payoff in terms of what makes fiction appreciable, you know, getting to know characters, getting to experience interesting plots. And that's far from true in Neuromancer. What I'm trying to say is that this novel is peopled by amazing, unforgettable characters. Case, the main character, this cyberspace cowboy who has very understandable goals in life and problems and issues, is a drug addict, is a terrible person in many ways, but also very relatable. Molly, the kick-ass co-protagonist of the novel, she's amazing but also relatable and far from being simply a boring, perfect killing machine. And there's a guy who is a program, a software on a CD-ROM. I don't know shit about computers, but he is kind of a program imitating the consciousness of a guy, and he is still an amazing character, and there are so many more flavorsome, terrible people populating the people in this novel. Another major achievement is the novel's setting, this futuristic urban sprawl that also extends partly into space, a place where people, when they are feeling prey to their baser impulses, they remind themselves that it's the meat talking, because we are in a future where people have already fused with technology irreversibly, deeply. People often quote the first line of this novel about the television sky, but the novel is filled with these type of descriptions, with seagulls following foam shoals in the sea, you know, waste in the ocean. All these details giving you the vibe of this future that is in so many ways recognizable, not all of those ways that positive after all. And the novel has a satisfying plot, very clearly defined, even though its broader implications are mostly left obscure in the course of the novel. And the ending, not going to spoil it, but you should probably know that it is some Inception type of shit. I'm talking about the Nolan movie, and some people are going to adore it, some people are going to flip the book and say, what is this shit? I actually loved it. I loved that kind of open ending that leaves you speculating on what actually is going on, what has happened, what the implications are. Overall, my experience of the novel was extremely positive, considering that this is very much not the type of fiction, not the type of genre and style I usually appreciate. I don't think it's a coincidence that I appreciated so much Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation, with its more traditional, unreliable narrator style of horror / science fiction, in spite of its very innovative perspective, its challenging take on certain tropes of horror fiction, but I didn't appreciate that much the more contemporary, innovative, slightly experimental perspective and style of Acceptance and Authority, third and second volume in that series. The only criticism I have, and it's a very light one by all means, is that possibly in the second half of the book, especially in the last 100 pages, the novelty of the whole thing had started to wear off and the style was getting a little bit tedious, and I just wanted to get closer to the conclusion, but that may just very well be because this, at the end of the day, it's still quite a difficult novel and it's going to be a challenging reading experience. Overall, it's so influential. It was, if you think it's been written in 1984, you understand how influential it was on the development of science fiction and cyberpunk, all those subgenres, on our collective consciousness of certain things such as the cyberspace and all these things. But there's so much written about this, written about Neuromancer's influence on popular culture, that you can read a lot about those things. I won't talk about it. What I'm going to say is, if you are a fan, if you're curious about challenging fiction, about experimental cult novels, or very simply put of science fiction, you cannot afford not to have read Neuromancer. It's one of those novels that's just so important. Nowadays, lots of people argue for a need to revolutionize our literary canons and to each of us build our own literary canon, and I appreciate that feeling and I agree with it in many ways, but I'm just raising an issue here. We also have to consider that the idea of a literary canon is so that we have a common set of books we have all read, so that when we discuss literature we have a common understanding we can start from. If each of us builds their own canon, that inevitably is going to be compromised. It's one of those paradoxes. Neuromancer, what I want to say is, I think it's going to stay in the canon of science fiction for a long time, and it's one of those novels you have to read if you have an interest in those things. Do let me know what you thought about the novel, and do let me know if, unlike me, you had a very smooth, very enjoyable reading experience. If at any time all throughout the novel you were you understood clearly what was going on. I'm very curious about that. Let me know in the comments below. In a second I'll put links on the screen to a video I filmed about Jules Verne, a great writer, also to some video about Jonathan Letham's science fiction novels, also very quirky, also amazing. Thanks as always for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next review. Bye, guys.